Hello again. Welcome to New Testament Survey, Part 4. Today we're going to begin with the book of First Corinthians. The epistles of 1st and 2nd Corinthians form a very valuable and indispensable part of our New Testament. They're filled with principles and direct commandments regarding the conduct of believers in local church matters. No problem in the local church should present any greater difficulty than what should be done about it than is found in these two Corinthian epistles. And here we are going to look at the epistle of 1 Corinthians. God is the author of 1 Corinthians, as well as the rest of the Bible, of course. And the human writer was the Apostle Paul. 1 Corinthians was actually about the third epistle that was written by Paul. And the fact that he was the human writer has never been seriously questioned by anyone. And I believe that the following evidences here are very conclusive in the matter. First, the writer calls himself Paul in chapter 1, verse 1, and in chapter 16, verse 21. Secondly, the book contains many personal references to Paul's experiences as recorded in the book of Acts. Third, the contents of the epistle, they actually harmonize with what we know of Corinth in Paul's time. Next, many early writers recorded that Paul was the writer of this book. And finally, the style of writing is very similar to other epistles that are known to be Paul's writing. 1 Corinthians, it is addressing problems in the church. Certain local problems had developed in the fellowship of the church at Corinth. The problems were so serious that when Paul heard of them, he immediately sat down and wrote the book of 1 Corinthians. These local church problems existed in at least 4 different areas. The first problem area was the dispute over ministers. Paul's first visit to Corinth occurred during his second missionary journey. You'll find that in Acts chapter 18 and verse 1, beginning there. After a great ministry in Corinth, Paul continued on to Ephesus, and from there he went on to Jerusalem and then to Antioch. Shortly after Paul left Corinth, the Alexandrian Jew named Apollos came to Corinth. And he was such an eloquent speaker that the immature Corinthian believers, they became unduly impressed with his exalted speech and his preaching. They began to squabble over who was the greatest speaker among the apostles and preachers that they had heard. This dispute led to the formation of little parties or little groups within the church at Corinth. Each group claimed special loyalties to its own chosen preacher. And they would say things like, I am of Apollos, or I am of Paul's, or I am of Cephas, or I am of Christ. You know, when Paul received word regarding their problems, he quite naturally felt that the situation was dangerous and it demanded some immediate correction. The second problem area involved disorders in, moral conduct in the church. Chapter 5 in 1 Corinthians deals with a very serious moral behavioral problem. In chapter 6, serious personal disputes between believers in Corinth had become so heated that some believers were actually taking one another to court. The third problem area was doctrinal misunderstandings. Paul apparently received a letter from the church in Corinth containing several questions concerning certain doctrines and beliefs that were puzzling to some of these believers. He carefully answered 7 doctrinal questions from chapter 7 through chapter 16. Paul's reply to the Corinthians is well marked by the little conjunction, now. And here's a quick rundown on these 7 doctrinal questions, including what chapter and verse they begin in and the opening lines of each new subject. So in chapter 7, verse 1, now, there's that now. Now, concerning these things, the subject it concerned here is the subject of marriage. Number 2 begins with chapter 7, verse 25. Now, concerning virgins, and that subject that he was addressing here was addressing the unmarried. The third one begins in chapter 8, verse 1. Now, in touching things offered unto idols. This is concerning food that's been offered to idols. Number 4 begins in chapter 11, verse 2. Now I praise you, brethren, and this is addressing the Lord's Supper or communion. The 5th item begins in chapter 12, verse 1. Now concerning spiritual gifts, and this, of course, is addressing spiritual gifts that are given to each and every individual. The 6th one begins in chapter 15, verse 1. Moreover, and this could be translated as saying now, moreover, brethren, I declare unto you, and this is addressing the resurrection of Christ. And the 7th item begins in chapter 16, verse 1. Now concerning the collection of, and this is about the collections for the poor at Jerusalem. The 4th and the final problem area in the church was the delinquency in giving to help the poor in Jerusalem. Paul was gathering money from all the churches that he had established in order to help take care of the problem of widespread suffering of the poor in Jerusalem as a result of a serious famine at that time. Apparently, the church at Corinth had been so busy squabbling over various issues that the people had neglected to attend to this matter. And this is seen in chapter 16 and verses 1 through 4. Back in Acts chapter 20, verse 31, we see that Paul had a very fruitful ministry in Ephesus, and that lasted about 3 years. During the latter part of Paul's ministry at Ephesus, he wrote the epistle of 1 Corinthians. Since Paul's ministry at Ephesus was from about AD 52 to AD 55, the probable date for the writing of 1 Corinthians was AD 55. The purposes of Paul writing the book of 1 Corinthians. Paul gives us about 10 different purposes for writing this book. Number 1, to rebuke them for their party spirit, and to establish the true concept of the relationships that ministers and apostles were to have with the local church. You'll see that in chapters 1 through about chapter 4. Number 2, he wrote this to reprimand the church for its failure to discipline one of its members who had been immoral. That is seen in chapter 5. Number 3, to reprove the church for its failure to settle its internal grievances in the privacy of the church fellowship rather than in a public court of law. We find that in chapter 6. The 4th item, to reply to their questions regarding various concerns, such as marriage and divorce and the eating of foods that had been sacrificed and dedicated to idols. And that's in chapters 7 through 10. Number 5, to rectify the disorders that had arisen regarding the public behavior of a certain woman in the church. That's in chapter 11. Number 6, to remedy abuses that had arisen regarding the proper exercising of spiritual gifts. That would be in chapters 12 through 14. Number 7, to refute some believers and to instruct others regarding the return of Christ and the resurrection of the righteous who had died. You'll find that in chapter 15. Number 8, to remind them to comply with his instructions regarding their participation in the offerings for the poor saints in Jerusalem. And that's in chapter 16, verses about 1 through 4. Number 9, to report to them about his future plans. This would be in chapter 16, verses 5 to 9 here. And number 10, he writes to recommend certain of his fellow workers to them. That would be in chapter 16, verses 10 through 18. So, who is this book written to? The book of 1 Corinthians. Well, the city of Corinth was a celebrated city located on a peninsula in southern modern-day Greece called the Peloponnese. And it was the capital city of the Roman province of Achaia. It was settled not long after the flood, and archaeologists have found traces of that ancient civilization. Ancient Corinth was heavily influenced by the Phoenicians with whom they traded. Proof of that is seen in the dyeing and weaving techniques that they showed. It's also seen in the style of ships that the Corinthians used, and even in their religion and mythology. Around 190 years before Paul's ministry, Corinth was razed to the ground by the army of a Roman general named Lucius Mummius. The new Corinth, in which Paul labored, was rebuilt by Julius Caesar in 44 BC. Various forms of arts and crafts were refined in ancient Corinth, and the Corinthians have long been known for their ingenuity and their artistic abilities, as well as their creativity. The city of Corinth was famous for its style of architecture, and many distinguishing artists lived in that area. Geographically speaking, Corinth was situated in one of the finest spots in all of Europe. It was built on the long, narrow isthmus that divided northern Greece from the Peloponnese. From the southeast, it was protected by the Acrocornus, which was a large mountainous rock that was almost 2,000 feet high. At its narrowest point, the isthmus, on which Corinth was built, was spanned by a level stone track called the Diolkos. And it was used to drag full-size sailing vessels on huge rollers to the other side of the isthmus, and thereby avoiding the long and the dangerous journey around the southern tip of Peloponnese. Now, this is kind of like the Panama Canal, which we're all familiar with, but instead of a waterway cut through there, what they did is they had a paved road across there, and then they would have logs for rollers, and they would roll the ship up on those and roll those on the logs over the isthmus and then back into the water on the other side. Quite an ingenious thing, and we can actually see some of those stones that were left there in that roadway today. Since Corinth communicated daily with the eastern and western world, as well as the north and the south, its commercial position was very strategic. The population of Corinth was estimated to have been as large as 800,000 people at that time of Paul's ministry. Corinth's harbors were crowded with ships from every part of the civilized world, and its streets were filled with travelers and merchants from almost every country of the world. At night, Corinth was a roaring, drinking, brawling city of sin, and by day, you could find foreign traders, Jewish peddlers, soldiers, sailors, athletes, slaves, and outcasts of every variety crowding the city marketplaces. Religiously, Corinth was the center of paganism. The famous temple of Aphrodite, who was the Greek goddess of love and beauty, was built on a high point of the Acrocornus, and it employed about 1,000 priestesses whose only purpose was immorality. The Corinthians, though deeply religious, were so degenerate that the term to Corinthianize came to be used for everyone who was either drunken or immoral. The Corinthians had two main idol deities that they worshiped. They were the sea god Poseidon, in whose name and under whose patronage the famous Isthmian Games were held. The second was the aforementioned Aphrodite. On the cultural side, Corinth was a hotbed of cynical philosophies. The Corinthians reveled in their knowledge, and they completely rejected all forms of external moral restraint of any kind. They held the view that each person was utterly free from any law other than their own. In fact, this view was the basic and the underlying cause of many of the problems that the Apostle Paul had to deal with in the Corinth church. An outline for the book of 1 Corinthians. Part 1, in answer to Chloe's report of divisions in the church. This would be in chapters 1, verse 1 through chapter 4, verse 21. The first part was the introduction, chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. The second part was the report of divisions there, chapter 1, verse 10 through 17. The third one, the reasons for the division, chapter 1, verse 18 through chapter 4, verse 21. There was misunderstandings of the gospel message, chapter 1, verse 18 through chapter 3, verse 4. There was misunderstanding of the gospel messengers, chapter 3, verse 5 through chapter 4, verse 5. Misunderstanding of Paul's ministry, chapter 4, verse 6 through 21. The second part is in answer to reports of immorality. This would be in chapters 5, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 20. Then he goes on, he talks about incest, chapter 5, verse 1 through 13. Talks about deliver the fornicators for discipline, chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. Then he talks about we need to separate yourselves from immoral believers, chapter 5, verse 9 through 13. Going on to talk about concerning litigation or legal affairs between believers, chapter 6, verse 1 through 11. Warning against sexual immorality, chapter 6, verse 12 through 20. Part 3, in answer to the letter of questions. This would be in chapter 7, verse 1 through 16, verse 24. First part, counsel concerning marriage itself, chapter 7, verses 1 through 40. And then he talks about the principles for married life, chapter 7, verses 1 to 9. The principles of a married believer, chapter 7, verses 10 through 16. Principle for abiding in God's call, chapter 7, verses 17 through 24. Going on with the principles for the unmarried, chapter 7, verse 25 through 38. Principles for remarriage, chapter 7, verse 39 and 40. Goes on now, the counsel concerning spiritual liberty, and this is in chapter 8, verses 1 through about chapter 11, verse 1. So he begins with the principles of liberty and the weak believer, chapter 8, verse 1 through 13. Gives an illustration of Paul and his liberty next, chapter 9, verses 1 through 27. The warning against forfeiting liberty, chapter 10, verses 1 through 13. Paul exhorts them to use liberty to glorify God, chapter 10, verses 14 through 11, verse 1. The counsel concerning public worship, chapter 11, verse 2 through chapter 14, verse 40. And this includes principles of public prayer, chapter 11, verse 2 through 16, the rebuke of disorders at the Lord's table, chapter 11, verse 17 to 34. And then principles of exercising spiritual gifts, chapter 12, verse 1 through chapter 14, verse 40. Part 4, counsel concerning the resurrection, chapter 15, verses 1 through 58. First part is the fact of Christ's resurrection itself, chapter 15, verses 1 through 11. Then he talks about the importance of Christ's resurrection. That's in chapter 15, verses 12 through 19. Then he gives the order of the resurrections, chapter 15, verses 20 through 28, and then the moral implication of Christ's resurrection. That'd be chapter 15, verses 29 through 34. The next would be the bodies of the resurrected dead, chapter 15, verses 35 to 50. And then the bodies of the translated living, chapter 15, verse 51 to 58. Part 5, counsel concerning the collection for Jerusalem. That's in chapter 16, verses 1 to 4. And part 6 was the conclusion, chapter 16, verses 5 to 24. Now, the key verse here, I do believe, for 1 Corinthians. This is something you need to memorize. And that verse is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and 4. And Paul says, "For I deliver unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures." Once again, that's 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and 4. Now, to me, why are these verses important? Because this is the whole gospel message right here in those two verses. And this is everything that the gospel is leading up to. Christ died for our sins, he was buried, and he rose again. Very important verses. So take some time and memorize that. Okay, natural progression would be the book of 2 Corinthians. Paul's second epistle to the Corinthians is the most autobiographical of his epistles. One Christian author pointed out that it is neither doctrinal nor practical in the strictest sense of those terms, but is actually intensely personal, he said. It's made up of explanations, of defense, of protests, appeal, reproach, accusations, threatening, all with a lot of motion blended with the most subtle irony in there, running throughout the whole thing. There is, once again, no question at all that the author of 2 Corinthians is the Apostle Paul. And there are a couple of reasons for making that statement. The first one is that Paul's signature, once again, appears 2 times. It's in chapter 1, verse 1, and chapter 10, verse 1. The second reason is that the style of writing is unmistakably that of the Apostle Paul. The third reason is that the status of the writer as an apostle is that of Paul. The problems that are presented in 2 Corinthians are just a continuation of the same problems that caused Paul to write his first letter to the Corinthians. It seems apparent that Paul's first letter to the Corinthians had little effect on that party spirit that they had that had disrupted the fellowship of the church in Corinth. In fact, not only had their party spirit increased in strength, but it had also advanced in the boldness to the point of actually challenging the apostolic authority of Paul himself. This growing boldness had been helped along by the arrival of an anti-Pauline party that came to Corinth. And presumably they came from Jerusalem, and they organized the opposition of Paul that was already in the church. These new arrivals from Jerusalem adopted a very superior attitude, a superior spirit, representing themselves as being Christ and calling themselves apostles of Christ. And we see that in chapter 10, verse 7, and in 11, verse 13. Let me read that. Chapter 11, verse 13 to you. And it says, "For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ." You know, about that time, it seems that Paul paid a short visit to Corinth, which was not recorded in the book of Acts, and he went to correct these disorders that were going on there. However, his attempt was not only unsuccessful, but also proved to be quite painful for him because he was grossly insulted by the ringleader of the opposition party. And upon his return to Ephesus, Paul wrote a letter of severe rebuke to the church at Corinth, and he sent it to them by way of Titus. This letter of rebuke is not part of the 27 books of the New Testament, and so it's lost to us today. The letter was probably directed primarily against the Judaizers and their ringleader, who had treated Paul so disrespectfully. After Paul wrote the letter of rebuke to the Corinthians, he eagerly awaited the return of Titus to learn the effect of the letter upon the Corinthian believers. In the meanwhile, the uproar of the silversmiths that we read about that we read about in Acts chapter 19 in verses 21 to 41 made it necessary for Paul to leave Ephesus ahead of schedule. And so he went on to Troas, stopped there for a brief but a very fruitful ministry there. And then he hurried on to Macedonia to meet Titus and to get his report. Paul and Titus met somewhere in Macedonia. Paul heard the good news that his letter had won the majority of the dissenters back to their former loyalty to him, so much so that they had even punished the ringleader of the opposition quite severely, it appears. We see that again in chapter 2, verses 5 to 11. However, it is clear from chapters 10 through 13 that there were still some rebellious believers in Corinth who were openly opposed to Paul and his ministry. Paul had mingled feelings of joy and regret. Joy because of the change in mind of the majority of the people, and regret because of those who were still in rebellion to him. That's why Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. He sent it back to Corinth by the hands of Titus and at least two other unnamed disciples. We see that in chapter 8, verses 16 to 24. 2 Corinthians was delivered to the church at Corinth by Titus and at least two other disciples whose names are not given. One of the unnamed disciples may have been Trophimus. Some consider it strange that Titus, who delivered the letter to the Corinthians and was so closely associated with Paul, is not mentioned once by name in the book of Acts. However, Titus is found in Acts, although he's not mentioned by name. In Acts chapter 15, verse 2, we read of a dispute in the Jerusalem church that arose concerning legalism. The dispute concerned whether Gentile Christians should be required to be circumcised and keep the Jewish law. It was decided that Paul, Barnabas, and certain other of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and the elders about this question. And those certain others of them that it talks about included Titus, as we learn from reading Galatians chapter 2, verse 3. You know, it is probable that Paul himself is the one that won Titus to Christ in view of the words of Paul in the book of Titus, chapter 1, verse 4. And verse 4 says, "To Titus, mine own son after the common faith, grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, our Savior." Beautiful passage there. Titus was a Greek Christian, a companion of Paul on some of his missionary journeys, and a trusted and a valuable associate of his. Titus is mentioned in several passages of Paul's epistles, such as the book of 2 Corinthians and Galatians and 2 Timothy, as well as the book of Titus. There is no further information on Titus for some years after his presence in Acts until he is mentioned by name 9 times in 2 Corinthians. His chief mission in Corinth seemed to have been to deal with internal disorders which had arisen there. He also seemed to have assisted the church in organizing the weekly love offerings for the poor saints at Jerusalem, as we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, and 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6. Over a period of time, Titus delivered 2 more letters to Corinth. We know nothing more of Titus for a long period of time after that. We do get the following information about him from other passages that have already been cited. After Paul's release from his first Roman imprisonment, he made several missionary journeys, and Titus accompanied him on those. On one of those journeys, Paul went to the island of Crete. When Paul left Crete, Titus remained behind to further organize the work there, as seen in Titus chapter 1, verse 5. In his letter to him, Paul informed Titus of his plans to send Artemas and Tychicus to Crete, thereby allowing Titus to join him at Nicopolis, which was a city on the southwest coast of Greece. We do not know if these plans were carried out or not, but we do know that Titus was with Paul for a while during his second Roman imprisonment. That can be seen in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 10. When Paul wrote 2 Timothy, Titus was in Dalmatia, which was part of modern-day Croatia, Bosnia, and part of Serbia. And he was probably on some errand for Paul there. After the account in 2 Timothy, though, Titus kind of disappears from the biblical record. The unnamed brother that's mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 18, may have been Trophimus, one of Paul's most valued and trusted helpers. This man was a native of Ephesus, which we see in Acts chapter 21, verse 29. And he became the innocent cause of Paul's arrest in Jerusalem, it appears. The Jews had seen Paul and Trophimus together in the streets. Then, when Trophimus innocently wandered into a part of the temple that was forbidden to Gentiles, Paul's opponents immediately assumed that Paul had brought Trophimus into the temple to show his contempt for the law. And this caused a tremendous uproar in Jerusalem that resulted in Paul's arrest. Trophimus undoubtedly accompanied Paul to Rome and was with him during his later missionary trips following his release from the first Roman imprisonment. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 20, Paul said, Trophimus have I left it at Miletum sick. And so it cannot be definitely proved that the reference in 2 Corinthians is Trophimus, but it is, I think, quite logical to think that it could have been him. I believe that Paul wrote the book of 2 Corinthians for the following reasons and purposes. Number one, he wrote to explain the purpose of his suffering while in Asia. Number two, to excuse and thereby justify himself and his change in plans regarding his proposed visit to Corinth. Number three, to encourage the church not to be too harsh in its discipline of the ringleader of that opposition party. Number four, to express his joy because of the effect of his previous letter upon the church in Corinth. Number five, to exalt the gospel and its ministry by showing its superiority to the law and its ministry. Number six, to encourage the Corinthian church to settle quickly the matter already mentioned in 1 Corinthians concerning the love offerings for the poor saints in Jerusalem. Number seven, to encourage the rebellious minority to become separated from worldliness and to be reconciled to him and to his ministry. And number eight, to establish once and for all his authority as an apostle. You know, the unity of 2 Corinthians has been questioned by some expositors and scholars, and they say that there's a sudden change of tone in chapters 10 through 13. And this shows that these chapters are a fragment of some other letter, perhaps, which somehow found its way into 2 Corinthians. Well, I think this supposed different tone can be easily explained by the fact that in chapters 1 through 9, Paul is addressing the majority in Corinth who had become reconciled to him. And on in chapters 10 through 13, he was speaking to the minority who were still holding themselves in rebellion to both Paul and his ministry. So he was talking to two different groups there. So he would talk in a different manner. Paul intended to write his next letter to Corinth from Ephesus, but was forced to leave Ephesus because of the revolt of the silversmiths. Eventually, Paul met with Titus in the Roman province of Macedonia, and he was told the good news about the effect of his previous letter upon the church at Corinth. The common view is that 2 Corinthians was written from the Roman province of Macedonia. Several early Greek manuscripts suggest the epistle was written from Philippi, which was a city located in Macedonia. This is entirely acceptable from every point of view, I do believe. The date of the writing is set at about AD 55. So let's look at an outline of the book of 2 Corinthians. Part 1, Paul's explanation of his ministry. This would be in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 7, verse 16. We begin with an introduction. Chapter 1, verse 1 through 11. The next part would be Paul's explanation of his change of plans. This would be chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 13. He begins with Paul's original plan, chapter 1, verse 12 through 22. Then goes on to Paul's change of plans, chapter 1, verse 23 through chapter 2, verse 4. Paul's appeal to forgive, chapter 2, verse 5 through 13. Next, it goes on to Paul's philosophy of his ministry, chapter 2, verse 14 through chapter 6, verse 10. And that includes the first part, part A, Christ causes us to triumph, chapter 2, verse 14 through 17. Part B, changed lives prove that ministry, chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. Part C, the new covenant is the basis of the ministry, chapter 3, verses 6 through 18. Part D, Christ is the theme of ministry, chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. Part E, trials abound in the ministry, chapter 4, verses 8 through 15. Part F, motivation in the ministry, chapter 4, verse 16 through chapter 5, verse 21. Part G, giving no offense in the ministry, chapter 6, verses 1 to 10. Now we get on to Paul's exhortations to the Corinthians, and this includes chapter 6, verse 11 through about chapter 7, verse 16. The first part is Paul's appeal for reconciliation, chapter 6, verses 11 through 13. And then we have Paul's appeal for separation from unbelievers, chapter 6, verses 14 through chapter 7, verse 1. Go on with Paul's meeting with Titus, chapter 7, verses 2 to verse 7. And then part D, Corinthians' response to Paul's letter, chapter 7, verses 8 through 16. Part 2, the second part here, is Paul's collection for the saints. And this includes chapters 8, verses 1 through chapter 9, verse 15. First, we give an example of the Macedonians, chapter 8, verses 1 through 6. The second thing they do is the exhortation to the Corinthians, chapter 8, verse 7 through chapter 9, verse 15. And that includes section A, the example of Christ to begin with, chapter 8, verse 7 through 9. Part B, the purpose of giving, chapter 8, verse 10 through 15. Part C, the explanation of the delegation, chapter 8, verses 16 through 9, verse 5. Now, the exhortation of giving is part D, chapter 9, verses 6 through 15. The third part here is Paul's vindication of his apostleship. And this includes chapter 10, verses 1 through chapter 13, verse 14. The first part is Paul answers his accusers, chapter 10, verses 1 through 18. The first part, part A, the charge of cowardice is addressed, chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. Part B, the charge of worldliness is answered, chapter 10, verses 3 through 9. Part C, the charge of personal weakness is answered, chapter 10, verse 10. Can't understand why Paul was upset by any of this, can you? Part 2, Paul defends his apostleship. Excuse me. Chapter 11, verses 1 through chapter 12, verse 13. Part A of that, Paul's declaration of his apostleship, chapter 11, verses 1 through 15. Part B, Paul's sufferings support his apostleship, chapter 11, verses 16 through 33. Part C, Paul's revelations support his apostleship, chapter 12, verses 1 through 10. Part D, Paul's signs support his apostleship, chapter 12, verses 11 through 13. The third part here is Paul announces his forthcoming visit. This would be chapters 12, verse 14 through chapter 13, verse 10. The first part of this would be part A, Paul's concern not to be a financial burden, chapter 12, verses 14 through 18. Part B, Paul's concern not to find them carnal, chapter 12, verses 19 through 21. And part C here, Paul's warning to examine themselves, chapter 13, verses 1 through 10. And part 4 is, of course, the conclusion, chapter 13, verse 11 through 14. So that's the outline there for the book of 2 Corinthians. Now, our key verse for 2 Corinthians, and this is 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 9. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest on me. My grace is sufficient for thee. What a wonderful verse. All right, with that, we should be up to our time limit for right now. We'll come back with part 5.